Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the B. Thomas Golisano College of Computing and Information Sciences and to the Dean's Lecture Series. I'm Andrew Sears, I'm the Dean of the College, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. But before we get started, I want to acknowledge our professional interpreters, Jessica Goldman and Erica Vasquez, and thank them for the services they're providing today. So please join me. So the goal of this series is pretty simple. We want to bring leaders in academia, industry, and government to campus to share their experiences and their insights with our faculty, with our students, and with the community at large. And with that in mind, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Linda Northrop. Linda is the Chief Scientist of the Software Solutions Division of the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. And is a renowned expert in the area of ultra-large-scale software systems. She led the research that results in the book, Ultra-Large-Scale Software Systems, the Software Challenge of the Future, and is a distinguished member of the Association of Computing Machinery. And today's lecture, she's going to be sharing her experiences working with these large, complex systems. So without any further delay, it's my pleasure, and please join me in giving our guest a warm RIT welcome. Linda.
Well, thanks very much for that kind introduction. I do come from the Software Engineering Institute, and the Software Engineering Institute is a research and development center that's part of Carnegie Mellon University. The main footprint is in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is where I am, but we have offices worldwide. A fairly large-size office in Washington. And basically, we were set up to make software and software practices better. We do our work through research, through development, demonstration, transition, and we work with the Department of Defense, but other arms of the government as well. We work with industry, and we work with academia. How many people have ever heard of the SEI? A few of you. How many of you know we do anything besides CMM and process improvement? Okay, a few less of you. Okay, so the biggest group at the SEI is CERT. How many people have heard of CERT? Computer Emergency Response Team? Okay, so that's our security branch, and that's really the very largest arm of the SEI. The process improvement is now mostly departed from the SEI. We transitioned CMMI to another organization. But I come from a different world. I come from a world of software architecture, software product lines, component technology, and at least I know some of you are familiar with some of these books, and I know some of this is taught in the software engineering program here at RIT. It's really my pleasure to be at RIT because I used to be in Rochester for 20 years, and I have always had a large degree of respect for RIT because you do here what we do at the SEI. We do research, and then we work directly with organizations to actually implant that research, to pilot that research, to see what the problems are, and then bring them back to the research community. So I have always admired the model here. I think sometimes it's difficult tension, as I described with other folks, because we experience that at the SEI. But a large part of my career has been in advancing technology in these areas, but that's not what I'm going to talk to you about. What I'm going to talk to you about today is something I'm very passionate about. Dean Sears talked about this study that I led in ultra-large-scale systems. And that's what I'd like to share with you, because there's some insights that have profoundly changed my professional career and my worldview, and I'd like to share those with you. So I will give you a little bit of a reprise on the study. Has anybody actually read this study? Oh, great. Okay. Because otherwise, you could take a nap for 10 minutes, but don't. I'm going to give you a little reprise of the study. I'm going to bring you up to speed because that study was done in 2006, and the world's changed a little bit since then. I will end with some implications on software engineering, and just a teaser, I'll show you some research we're doing at the SEI, but truth be told up front, I'm not going to be able to delve into that, but I will be here for the reception and for some conversations afterwards in case people would like to hear more about that. Okay, so the beginning of the ULS system journey. Think about the 2005-2006 time period. What was happening? Okay, NASA first entered the Mars orbit. Vista was released. Who even remembers Vista? Saddam Hussein met his ultimate demise. Long in the waiting. Okay, what else happened? Blackberries. How many use a Blackberry? Okay, do you even know what they are? In 2006, there were almost 5 million users of Blackberries. The iPhone had not made the scene. Beyoncé was rocking the music world, and my team, the Pittsburgh Steelers, won the Super Bowl. We won't talk about how they're doing now. Above those particulars, we were grappling with some societal problems. Now, every generation has some global problems, some that they inherit, some that they create, and those problems become the target of scientists, of innovators, of entrepreneurs, investors, and altruists, people who just want to make a difference. And those were some of ours. But what was different about our world back then, and ever so much more now, is the pervasive dependence on software. Software was in everything, from our fridges to our medical devices to our financial systems. And that software gave us a speed and an agility that we hadn't seen before in every facet of our lives. Also, beginning with the internet, there was this tremendous trend towards scale. The internet was both the result of and the enabling infrastructure for a whole new form of collective action, of connectedness among people and machines that had not been experienced before. 1997, the web hit the scene, and nothing was the same after that. Even in 2006, people didn't go to experts anymore to get information. They Googled it. And how much that got mirrored into all of these various areas where these societal problems were most manifest. So, for example, in the healthcare infrastructure, there was the beginning of an infrastructure that would connect patients and physicians and researchers and insurance companies. And, well, we kind of know how that's going now. So, but a problem of scale. Don't let anybody kid you. This is a tremendously large-scale endeavor. I don't believe 500 million lines of code, but that's a whole other issue. In Homeland Security, a complete communication skin of cameras and sensors coupled with enterprise systems and handheld devices and people who are trying to defend against bad guys, but also natural disaster, something we have come to know as Homeland Security. And networked in automobiles. Back in 2006, people were thinking about intelligent transportation, connecting automobiles, which then had upwards of 100 million lines of code, together. Think about the complexity in the scale of connecting automobiles. A big emphasis on the changing climate and energy and how we conserve energy, which marshaled millions of sensors and vast amounts of computational power to monitor what is called multimedia. And multimedia in this case is air, land, and water. So we were seeing these systems of tremendous scale growing in all of these areas and also in the military systems. Because what happened in the military systems is it became a goal of who has the most information. Superiority in information, thinking about information that comes from a vast array of sensors to an equally vast landscape of analysts, thinking about different levels of information needed by people who are making decisions down to the soldier who becomes a distributed platform. And all of this having to be maintained, sustained in a constantly changing environment where missions are changing, where the threat is changing, where the composition of forces we're using is changing, where equipment is changing, where technology is changing, all needing to be sustainable legally and economically. So in a conversation that I had with then Assistant Secretary of the Army, Claude Bolton, we talked about the problems, the challenges of what software had enabled and created in military systems. He was then the chief officer that was in control of something being developed called the Future Combat System. And the Future Combat System was, as the name implies, this wonderful connected system for the armed forces of the future. Now, if you watched FCS, as it was called, the movie, you were, wow, that is some cool capability. And then you had this blush of reality. How were they going to do that? The technology for making this happen didn't really exist, but that didn't stop the Army from buying it. So there was a dilemma. And Mr. Bolton knew, and I'm not dissing the contractor or any of the people in the Army, but there were challenges, let's just say that. And he said, you know, Linda, how will we ever develop billion lines of code systems when we can't even get the hundreds of million lines of code systems right? And so he funded the Software Engineering Institute to lead a study about these systems of the future and what they would look like and what the challenges were, and to actually think about the breakthrough research that would be needed in order to address some of these problems, which he was beginning to see the glimmer of. And so we put together a 9-person team of folks at the SEI with assorted talents, and we recognized that we needed to bring in some heavy hitters from the rest of the community, but we thought about who we needed. And we realized that we needed not just software engineers, not just computer scientists, but we needed people from other disciplines. Because if you think about what I am describing, this is not just about software, it's about software-reliant systems in the world in which we live. And economics and sociology and psychology all play a role in what we're trying to provide. So we gathered together this expert panel, and you will see that there are people, Carlos Baldwin from the Harvard School of Business, Gregory Abowd in computer science, but focusing on the human-computer connection. Jack Whalen, who was at Park, he's a sociologist. If I had it to do again, I would have made it more multidisciplinary, but trust me, that was enough egos for this particular group. So off we went on this study. And we took a typical reductionist approach, that is, we worked top-down to think about, well, what will the characteristics of these systems be, and what will the challenges be, and what's the research that's needed. But we worked inside and outside the box with lots of iteration, usage scenarios from FCS, from healthcare, from other places where we began energy, where we began to see these trends emerging. And we were inspired by the open source and collaborative communities, not so much in the software they were producing, but their philosophies of how they work together and their incentives for actually achieving outcomes. And we looked at other disciplines. We looked at economics. We became fixed for a little while on this nexus of economics and game theory called computational mechanism design, where you have self-interested players and you set the rules of the game such that these self-interested players will achieve the globally desired outcome. We looked at Carlos Baldwin's work in economics and modularity, where modularity provides economic value such that the economy will force that modularity to be sustained. We looked at networks everywhere, biological networks, networks existing in all sorts of real-world phenomena. We looked at simulated annealing. There were any number of disciplines where we were inspired by scale and how scale was addressed. And truthfully, I can share that the more we went down this path, the more ignorant I felt. Because I came in as a person thinking, well, I know a lot about software, and these are software-reliant systems, to realizing that what I needed to know was vastly out of my comfort zone. And I began to read books that I never imagined reading, and learning how much we didn't know. Well, ultimately, we did write this little book, and it was called, as Dean Sears said, Ultra-Large-Scale Systems, the Software Challenge of the Future. And we described the characteristics, the challenges in the research area that would be needed for these new systems. So what is an ultra-large-scale system? Is it just 100 billion lines of code? No. The amount of code is really the tip of the iceberg. It's scale across lots of other dimensions. So scale in terms of the amount of data, the data that's stored, that's accessed, that's manipulated. Scale in terms of the number of connections and interdependencies among the various players. So if you're thinking about even healthcare.gov, this is not just a website, my friends. This is about connecting to the Social Security system and the insurance companies. There are lots of different connections that have to happen. The number of hardware elements, whether they're boxes or sensors or embedded units or mobile devices, the number of computational elements, the sheer CPU capacity, the number of different system purposes, and the users of these, stakeholders with vastly different perceptions on the purpose of the system. And then thinking about these systems and how they interact, each having their own processes, these processes being connected to provide intended behavior, but very often emergent behavior, behavior that's not anticipated because they're being used in unanticipated ways, in unanticipated contexts, by unanticipated people. The number of overlapping policy domains, if you think about the financial market infrastructure and the various economies and their various financial regulations and their policies and cultures, and how all of this somehow has to be supported by the financial market infrastructure. And then just the sheer number of people involved, whether those people are producers or consumers, developers, or part of the system itself. So we talked about these as webs of systems and people and policies and cultures. And this, more than anything, is what I'd like you to take away. Mary Shaw, whom you might know from the software engineering world, very famous lady in our discipline, was on this study, and she said, scale changes everything. And we thought it was a little bit of hyperbole, but as we worked more, we understood that she was absolutely right. It does change everything because many of the characteristics of these systems undermine the assumptions we make in traditional software engineering. So to start with, decentralization. Because of the very vast nature of these systems, they're decentralized. They're decentralized in data, they're decentralized in development, they're decentralized in evolution, they're decentralized in operation. There aren't a set of knowable pat requirements. In fact, they're inherently conflicting requirements. They generate what are called wicked problems. Riddle and Weber, in their theory of planning, talked about, dilemmas in the theory of planning, talked about wicked problems where the problem changed as you solved the problem. Now that's very different from, there are problems with requirements anyhow. You know, you build it for the customer and they don't really realize that they want something until they see what you've given them and that isn't what they wanted. That's one set of problems that we've all experienced. But this is different. The very nature of the problem changes as you solve it. Continuous evolution and development. These systems cannot be taken down. No one's going to take down the internet. No one is going to take down the military infrastructure or the smart grid. These things have to continuously operate, and they have to be upgraded in situ. So there are going to be changes of legacy systems connected, changes of technology, changes of people. And this all has to happen during the course of the activity of the life of these systems. Heterogeneous and inconsistent elements. So you've got legacy systems, you've got new systems, you've got different languages, you've got different versions of compilers of the same languages, you have different platforms. You have a host of different hardware and sensors and different versions of these things. And they're constantly changing. And then perhaps the big epiphany was the erosion of the people-system boundary. We in software engineering have typically thought about users. We are one of only 2 industries that thinks about the people we provide to as users. Think about the other one. Anyhow, people are elements of systems. They are part of the system. Perhaps the tip of the iceberg here was with Wikipedia. If you think about Wikipedia, there are very few people that are actually at the helm of Wikipedia. Who develops Wikipedia? We do. And in these new systems, the people become part of the system. Normal failures, that's not to say there are abnormal failures, it's to say that failures will be normal. If you have 1 million file transfers generating 1 error, but you have 1 million file transfers every day, you're going to have an error a day. So the whole idea is that in these systems this large, with their vast physical underpinnings and the number of potentially unanticipated connections, there will be failures. And so the idea is to prevent as many as you can, but to provide mechanisms that will cordon off the impact should a failure happen and warn the rest of the system that this has occurred. And new paradigms for acquisition and policy. If you heard President Obama yesterday, you heard him speak about the failed acquisition practices we now have in the government, and that being one of the systemic causes for what's going on in health.gov. And indeed, these new ultra-large-scale systems require different thinking about how we acquire and the policies that we incentivize contractors with. So what are our approaches to software engineering? What have we relied on? Well, we've relied on an engineering perspective, requirements, design, and build, with lots of supporting documents and inherent V&V. But recognize that this has a hierarchical, reductionist mentality that is predicated on some sort of central control. And that isn't going to work for these systems that are inherently decentralized. Then there was a backlash to our engineering perspective, the Agile movement, which is to say, embrace change, and we're going to have functionality over documents, and we're going to engage the customers at all levels and provide incremental value, and everybody's doing Agile. But the truth of the matter is, when you do Agile at scale, you take some risk. You accrue some technical debt, because there are some things that you can't do when you just refactor on a continuous basis. There are architectural decisions, there are topological decisions that have to be engineered. So what do we do here? Dick Gabriel, who I think about as one of the most profound thinkers in our field, said, you know, in the engineering world, we tried to prevent change. With the Agile approach, we embrace change. What about injecting change? Do we have anything that does that? Because in these systems, which will have to adapt and evolve in situ, we'll have to inject change. and that sort of boggled our minds. Alan Kay said that the right perspective is worth 80 IQ points. And what we realized is that a lot of our thinking, our engineering mindset, undermined assumptions of systems at this scale, that we couldn't do discrete interval improvements, that we had no concept of how to reason about collective action of people and autonomous units and computational units, that we didn't know how to engineer to deal with failures and to embrace failures and to adapt dynamically to failures. So we needed a new perspective. And I'm going to give a true confession here, because especially students have written and said, what's your definition of ULS system? Well, we never defined it. So instead, we used analogies. Now, analogies, a little bit more than a figure of speech, kind of a rhetorical argument, but very powerful. Now, no analogy is perfect, but let me give you, you need a little breather right now, let me give you a little bit of an example of the power of analogy. So Brian Clark, who is the founder of Copyblog, tells this little story. So there's this elderly man who walked into his doctor's office and he said, "Doctor, my 22-year-old bride is pregnant, and you know that I had a vasectomy. How did that happen?" I was pretty upset. The doctor said, in a very relaxed tone, "Let me tell you a story." So there was this hunter, and the hunter went off from his cabin into the woods surrounding, and inadvertently he grabbed his umbrella instead of his rifle. And lo and behold, he was approached by a bear, and he aimed his umbrella and he shot the bear, and the bear died. And the old man said, "Well, that's impossible. Somebody else killed the bear." And the doctor said, "Precisely." So, we didn't define a ULS system. We said ULS systems are like cities, because if you've read any of our architecture work, we milked considerably the analogy of buildings, and we got a lot of mileage out of thinking about an architecture as being the structure of a building, and it has various different views and dimensions and the like. But then we got thinking, this isn't anything like a building. Then we were thinking, well, maybe it's a building that transforms itself, which is kind of a heady thought. Or maybe it's a neighborhood of buildings. But then we realized it really wasn't about a building. It was about cities. And if we think about cities, cities are not the complete design of one individual. Cities emerge. In cities, we have zoning laws. We provide infrastructure. We provide support. We provide incentives. But we do not dictate that you have to live in Victor. Why do you live in Victor? Maybe they have a good school district, or maybe the taxing structure there incentivizes you. Or you move to a particular place and there aren't other people living there, but it becomes attractive. And then all of a sudden grocery stores grow up and roads grow up to accommodate that. Cities emerge, they grow. No one takes down the city. So road construction, Rochester, Pittsburgh, wherever you go, there's road construction that doesn't take down the city, mostly. Fire. We don't advocate fire, but fires happen. And so we have fire departments. Crime. We don't advocate crime, but we have police. So cities, a much better analogy for these systems than buildings. Ecosystems, biological ecosystems, well, what are they? They're dynamic communities of interdependent and competing organisms that live in a complex and changing environment. They interact with each other, with the environment. They're competing. There are nutrient flows. And there are robustness mechanisms so that we can understand their health. So we thought that these are socio-technical ecosystems. They're dynamic communities. There's interaction. There are information flows of economic value and security, competition for resources, resource management, rules, incentives, adaptation. And so once we had this mental model, we thought about the challenges to build these. First of all, the design. And it's the design not just of code, not just of software, it's what we call design at all levels and of all levels. So designing the infrastructure and the rules and the policies and the governance and what you would want analogous to a fire department or a police department or zoning laws, but then design at all levels of the software systems themselves. Orchestration and control, how do we keep these in harmonious working order? What are the incentives we provide? There must be economic incentives. There need to be social incentives, as well as engineering incentives for making the right interfaces, connections, functionality, rules. And then how do we measure their health? What's the metrology for this? So many of you are familiar with our architecture work, and we coined the term quality attribute and got people thinking that it's not just about functionality, it's about security, it's about modifiability, it's about openness and what those things mean for system. What are the analogous quality attributes for systems of this size? How do we measure them? Are there some gross indicators, something like GDP, that we could measure about the health of these systems? And we reasoned that with the research we were doing, we were unlikely to meet those challenges. And so we posited a set of research areas where we felt breakthrough research was needed, not incremental research. So we didn't talk, at the time, SOA was really popular. We didn't say, hey, y'all, go out and do SOA. Instead, we talked about some more fundamental research that we thought needed to happen. And I invite you to read about this. This is the part of the book that requires multiple bowls of popcorn because it gets pretty technical. But human interaction, we talked about context-assistive computing. We talked about modeling communities. We talked about how we understand collective action and think about the people in a computational way. Computational emergence. We talked about mechanism design. We talked about meta-heuristics from other disciplines. We talked about digital evolution. Design at all levels and of all levels. Computational engineering. Research needed to better represent something in the computer that would provide more semantic relevance to what we're doing, a new semantic calculus that would help us navigate through the semantic diversities with all of the various stakeholders in some of these systems. Adaptive system infrastructure, thinking about what is essentially the middleware that would allow us this continuous evolution that would be decentralized, that would in fact enable the kind of interaction that's required. The system quality, how do we predict it? How would the ULS system know when it's unhealthy, and how could it adapt itself? So an internalization of these quality attributes, and then policy acquisition and management. So what we learned is that there really is an unstoppable trend toward scale, and it really does change everything. And that undermines some of the assumptions we make in software engineering, which requires that we take some new approaches. But there are manifestations of scale in other disciplines that we can, in fact, rely on, be inspired by, which leads us to the need for some multidisciplinary research. So our assertion was to Mr. Bolton and the DoD, there are gaps. This, in fact, is not going to happen with the capability we have. Well, it can happen, but it would be like pushing a whale down the beach. You know, you're going to get really bloody toes and the progress isn't going to be significant. So we advocated for funding for some breakthrough research. Some observations. We never really suggested that all systems will be ULS systems. I mean, clearly there are systems that won't be. We didn't want to get into the name war. So people said, well, I've got a system of systems. Is that a ULS system? You know, I really didn't care. We didn't care. What we're interested in are these characteristics that are challenges to the way we currently do things. There were some folks who say, well, yeah, but what you're talking about is systems engineering, and we got it knocked. We solve all these problems. I would argue that just isn't so, because the one thing that systems engineering is missing big time is software, and software is the reason why we have, in fact, these large-scale systems. Not having something that called out network security, or what people call cybersecurity, turned out to be a big red flag, and people bloodied us for that afterwards. We probably would have changed that. And what we have found ourselves is that the research in this area has an impact on systems that aren't necessarily ultra-large scale. So I don't want to end here with something that's 6 years old. I want to whirlwind bring you up to the future to help underscore the even greater relevance of this study in today's world. So what's happened 7 years later? Well, we've had some tremendous natural disasters. The background is actually the satellite image from Hurricane Katrina. Tsunamis, so all of the natural climate disasters unfortunately coming to pass. Finally, Osama bin Laden, terrorist long sought, was killed. But we also saw collective action, which is fueled by social media, having national consequences in Iran, in Egypt, and elsewhere. We saw the housing crisis. And something that might have gotten your attention or maybe not, but on May 6th, 2010, the Dow Industrial Average dropped more than 600 points in about 10 minutes. And we lost $800 billion in market value. It disappeared temporarily. Now, that did not occur because there was a bug in those financial systems. It occurred because systems were being connected in ways that had been unanticipated. Because now a factor in financial trading systems are trading bots, autonomous agents that trade. And when those autonomous agents and the computational systems we have and people are in the mix, we result in some emergent behavior that has, in this case, some pretty profound consequences. And the speed at which this happens is incredible. And that's what connectedness and software has given us, speed and agility. Yeah, well, Beyonce sang at the Super Bowl, and we know that that makes her a mature artist. So we have some new people rocking the world. And we still have these same societal problems, and software is ubiquitous and often transparent. So let me just read to you, for the sake of, because one always needs to have just a little bit of entertainment here. So this is how ubiquitous and transparent it is. Software is everywhere. We have smart everything. We have smartphones, iPads, smart appliances. We have cloud computing. In a survey last fall, a US survey of over 1,000 people, 18 and above, 90% were ascertained to have been using cloud computing in some way, either by online banking or shopping or networking or storing photos or whatever. But 54% claimed they never used it. 32% think about it as something of the future, but clearly it is ubiquitous. 51% believe that weather can affect cloud computing. 29% think it has something to do with weather. 22% admit that they have pretended to understand how the cloud works. And 17% of those said they did so on a date. 14% in a job interview, but this one really made me laugh. 40% see that working, quote, in their birthday suit was the biggest advantage of cloud computing. So the whole deal is that software is everywhere and fuels everything, but most people are pretty much oblivious to it. And they think because you can quickly change an app on a on an iPhone that you can software engineer a profoundly impactful system. And we all know that's not true. So we have challenges, and this increased connectivity has brought us challenges in scale and complexity, decentralization, distribution, big data. You heard a wonderful talk on big data if you attended the earlier lecture in this series. Increased tempo, everything. We have an appetite for incredible tempo. Tempo in the marketplace, in the war theaters, in about everything we do. It must be fast. And sometimes these tempos are out of sync. So there is a problem when we have mismatched ecosystem tempos. The sheer vulnerability of this connectedness. You know, the internet was bred on this whole principle of anonymity, which has made it so successful, but also tremendously increased our vulnerability to attack. DoD isn't thinking, well, they do think about attack by big armies, but not so much anymore. They talk about cyber attacks because we know that people sitting in a room with a bunch of computers and all the time in the world can do more damage than big armies of the past. Collective action. And we're talking about the collective action of humans and autonomous agents and computing systems. And then a whole host of disruptive and emerging technologies that you're probably all familiar with, from the iPhone to Facebook that has 1.3 billion users, Twitter, Google Glass, holy connectedness, Batman. Think about it. 3D printing printed, I should say, a functioning gun. Pretty scary stuff. Cloud computing, drones, robots not just imitating human behavior, robots being part material, part digital, going where we can't, thinking on their own. These are some pretty amazing technologies. And when you look at our milieu, on the one hand, it's, and you're there somewhere here, there's our Rochester Institute of Technology. It's all about cyber defense, cyber security, cyber warfare, cyber, to the point who even knows what cyber means. And so we're trying to defend against this brave new cyber world. And at the same time, there are 80 million millennials, teens, 20-something, many of you are in that age bracket, and you are the people who live with selfies and 140 character communication, and you put everything out there and really don't care about privacy. So it's sort of a dichotomy, a disconnect, when everybody is trying to protect, and we have a whole generation of people who just put it all out. Now, this is interesting because there's a lot of criticism from people my age who are older than dirt about this generation. On the other hand, this generation is very accepting. It's a flat society, and it has created what's the crowd? Crowd herding, crowdsourcing, crowd development. I think I have time to tell you the story about the DARPA balloon experiment, but read about it. GitHub, distributed environment where there are 3.5 million users, there are 140 people in the company, and there is no manager. Reddit, they have about, I think last I read, something like 79 million users, and they have more than 4 billion pages viewed per month. And now DARPA, not just trying to do crowdsourcing to locate weather balloons across the US, which, by the way, the Geospatial Intelligence Agency said was an intractable problem, and the MIT Media Lab solved it in 8 hours and 52 minutes. But now we're looking at something a whole lot deeper. We're looking at computers that actually understand what's going on in the social media among adversaries, and then develop rhetorical arguments that will generate counter messaging to influence the tide of opinion. Read the BAA, it's for public knowledge. And then on the industrial side, we have a whole shift. And the shift is from products to services, what's being called the Internet of Things or the industrial internet. GE, Bosch, Siemens, all on this bandwagon. GE saying that by 2030, 2030, we can increase the GDP by $14 trillion. Because we're thinking not so much about manufacturing products, but about services. This relies on intelligent machines, predictive analytics, and people working collectively. So, people talk about cyber-physical systems. Ever heard that term? No? Okay, well, if someone tells you it's a new word for real-time embedded systems just to get more money for research, they're wrong. If people talk about real-time embedded systems that connect with the environment like a robot, they're partially right. What we're really talking about is a smart network system of sensors and actuators and processors designed to sense, control, interact with the physical environment and with humans, while adhering to real-time performance schedules in safety-critical ways. And then people talk about socio-technical ecosystems, platforms like the iPhone, the architecture, the governance, and the culture. And what we talked about was really the intersection of those. If you look through a set of ultra-large-scale system glasses, you will find that there are profound insights that will make you think about how you do your work. And let me leave you with one more insight here. We have talked about build time and run time traditionally. In ultra-large-scale systems, there's a blurring of the two. In order for these systems to be adaptive, there are topological architectural changes that happen during runtime. And this is heady from a software engineering standpoint. So, implications for software engineer, these characteristics are real. These systems have to be responsive, adaptive, and so do we. And so it isn't so much a normative, but a participatory way that we do our work. We have to think about pervasive and interconnected real-time systems. What does that do? You're connecting devices, medical devices, and you're connecting them to the internet. So you have what's called mixed criticality, things that don't mesh in terms of what you're trying to assure. Who was telling me, someone last night, about they would not allow, normally when you put in a pacemaker, you have remote monitoring with a remote control. When they did one for Dick Cheney, they would not have a remote control. Anyhow, composition strategies, thinking about humans, computational autonomous entities as peers, software assurance, not just designed for security, but also thinking about assurance of the behavior, big data, dynamic adaptability, and the use of heterogeneous platforms. And finally, thinking about sound, asynchronous software engineering practices in distributed settings. I'm going to quit here. I want to take some questions, but let me leave you with this. Scale is here. It does change things, and there are some tremendous opportunities for research and our future as software engineers, because my humble opinion is that software engineers are needed on systems like the healthcare infrastructure, and they're not there. And what we need to do is not wait to be asked. We've got to be relevant and get involved in helping solve some of these tremendous challenges that are now pervasive in very important parts of our society. So my pleasure to speak with you on a Friday afternoon, and I'll take any questions or I'll see you outside. Thanks.
All right, Linda.
All right.
So in the context of education, how do you see, these things we see it marching all the time. How do you see this affecting computing education, software engineering, computer science, IT, whatever it is? what should we be addressing that traditionally we've not addressed?
Okay, for one thing, I think you need to have a great deal of respect for the other disciplines. And somehow, I know, because I lived it, how packed your curriculums are. But I think you absolutely have to admit interaction with people from other disciplines, because I think we have to. If you just think about what's happening with social media, and that is so much a part of the fabric of how our world is acting right now. That is as much sociological and psychological and economic as it is software-based. And we have to have a way to work together. So some multidisciplinary courses, teams, projects, I think are essential. I think one of the things people need to understand is how distributed systems work. So thinking about distributed systems and thinking about how some of the techniques that we work. I've got a group who's done model checking, automated verification, great stuff. How do you do that for algorithms for distributed systems? So lots of challenges when you ratchet it up to not being a system that you are entirely in control of, but it's distributed. So I think there are some challenges. And in an undergraduate level, you know, you still have to learn the fundamentals and the basics that will prepare you. But I think preparing people and thinking that they're going to go off and build apps or put up a read-only website and that's going to be the end-all and be-all, I just don't think that that's what we should do. We have to impart the idea that we do have to do engineering, that we have to do architectural thinking, but we have to admit this new realm of characteristics and possibilities that are not as comfortable.
So, do you still think there's room for the specialized person who, you know, works in this room and, I mean, it's not like he doesn't talk to anyone, but, you know, just does something?
You mean the wizard who works in the corner with a pointed hat with stars and moons on? Yeah. You know, I think there is still a need for people who are going to, the geeks who are going to create innovation, because we need that innovation. But it's that innovation in perspective, and I think the balance of the number of those people to the number of the other people is going to dramatically change.
Does computational thinking have a part in it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Computational thinking, and think about this. I like to think now that modeling humans in a computational way. There's a wonderful book, I can't think of the name right now, but I'll think about it, where we think about people and people being computational agents and how they react together and modeling them in computational ways to understand collective action.
I had the same question, but I'd like to rephrase it.
Okay.
Seems at times you could say that we have to adapt our software to people who don't realize what they're doing when they're using these large systems. Yet on the other hand, we say our population needs to be better educated how to think computationally so that they can more intelligently deal with these systems. So which way is it, or is it a bit of both, or what?
Well, you know what's kind of funny? To me, computing is an equalizer, because there are lots of people in disadvantaged countries who have time that maybe we don't have because we're frivoling in a way watching the Steelers. And they can become expert at computing, and they can hack into our systems with some disastrous effects. So I don't think we want to stop teaching people computing and mathematics and all of the rest. But your question about making things transparent, I think we have to ensure a world where the computing becomes so organic. So I don't know if you've read any of Dan Norman's stuff, but The Invisible Computer, the idea is that the computer will become like the pencil. You never really focus on the pencil or the pen when you're writing. But that required a lot of engineering to get to the point where it would be that way. I was talking with a group at lunch. You know, the whole idea in healthcare, electronic medical records, this is a wonderful thing, but I go to the doctor and he never listened to me anyhow, and now he's sitting there trying to type this into his electronic medical record, and I'm thinking, stop already, let me do that, and you listen to me, because I know how to do that. I can figure out this insane form. So I think there's a real imperative not only for people to know the power, but they're never going to know the power because you become more and more familiar with things, but for us to engineer in such a way that it is organic. I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, I kind of hate to bring it to a close, but we probably do need to wrap things up.
Okay.
So thank you for your presentation, your insights, and join me in thanking our speaker one more time.
Thank you.
And I have a small gift.
small gift.
Well, it's a small gift in a big package.
Okay,
in
okay, great.
Appreciation
Thank
of your time and coming up
Thank
and
you.
visiting us. And,
It was my pleasure.
Please join us out in the atrium for
Okay.
a few refreshments.
Okay, terrific. And if anybody is interested, I'll make sure the slides are available, and there's some research that I didn't get to talk about, but feel free. Feel free to email me.